Hello and welcome to the U.S. History Underground. I'm Mr. O'Hagan and I'm here with Mr. Zagari.
How we doing, folks?
Today on the Underground, foreign policy in the post-Vietnam era. Hi, folks. Well, we are close to the end of our AP curriculum, and Zags and I thought that it might be helpful to look at American foreign policy in the post-Vietnam era. There have been many events and movements that have impacted U.S. foreign policy since the fall of Saigon in 1975. Remember the video we showed in class, The Last Days in Vietnam?
Crazy.
That was 49 years ago, by the way, from the time we're recording this podcast. Absolutely nuts. But none of those events seem to have the lasting impact, the legacy of Vietnam. Isn't that right, Zags?
That's right, Mr. O. I mean, let's remember, American involvement in Vietnam was a product of the Cold War.
So we're doing context here, aren't we?
Of course we are. How can we start a podcast without context? We're the context guys, of course.
No, I'm good with that. I just didn't want to sneak it past our listeners.
Come on now. After all these podcasts, do you really think the underground army wouldn't pick up on the context of the story?
You're right. You're right. Well, by all means, carry on, Captain Context.
All right, well, thanks. Well, we find ourselves in Nam as early as 1954, sending advisors and military aid to keep the communists from overrunning the South. Diem, the president of South Vietnam, was a reliable anti communist, but he ran a brutal regime suppressing any opposition. Not exactly a champion of democracy here.
No, not at all. I mean, who can forget the monks who self-immolated
Absolutely.
to protest Diem's treatment of the Buddhists?
Ugh, just an awful sight, and not to be cold hearted about it, but an awful public relations mess from a U.S. diplomatic perspective. He was supposed to be our guy, representing our way of life to the communists. We really weren't being the best version of ourselves here.
No, certainly not through him. And he became such a liability that he's eventually overthrown and assassinated by South Vietnamese generals with the blessing of the American CIA. Sheesh. So Vietnam was a mess for the U.S. from the start.
So true. And as much as it pains me to speed past talking about Vietnam and what a mess it was throughout, when we finally leave in 1975, the whole war was viewed as a failure. It had torn the nation with domestic strife and protests. It had cost LBJ the presidency. And even Nixon, if you're thinking about Vietnam, this lasting legacy of Vietnamization and the Nixon doctrine of pulling troops out and not committing American boots on the ground in further conflict.
It was a drag for Nixon, too, absolutely. And the communists win. I mean, that's the real Cold War failure, isn't it? Above everything else, Sax, South Vietnam falls to the north, and the entire nation of Vietnam is now unified under a single communist government.
And even though they have no claim to any part of the victory, the Soviets and the Chinese take a victory lap over this American embarrassment.
Yeah, and I mean that's rubbing it in the wound, right? Just taking joy in your enemy's defeats.
Absolutely.
So this wound that American policymakers will have to deal with going forward, this is the legacy of Vietnam, isn't it? Their policies have to be made with this failure in mind. If they get into another mess like this one, the public's going to revolt at the voting booth. No elected official can afford to take on another Vietnam. And Johnson's Democrats learned that. Nixon's Republicans learned that. So how does this legacy manifest itself in the years that follow, Zax?
Well, Carter begins his presidency by embracing détente, hoping to alleviate the tensions between the U.S. and its communist rivals. But the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which ironically will become the Soviet version of Vietnam, kills public sentiment for that kinder, gentler approach to this.
Right. And when Reagan runs against Carter and is elected in 1980, he advocates a much harder line towards communism, right? I mean, he's kind of that old 1950s Cold Warrior mentality. But for all of Reagan's bluster and of all of the talk of challenging the Soviets about communism, Reagan realizes that America will not stand for another Vietnam. So he offers something that comes to be known as the Reagan Doctrine. Zax, can you give us a sense of what this approach called for?
Absolutely. Reagan is hypercritical of Carter's weakness as president. The hostage crisis in Iran, Soviet imperialism in Afghanistan, Marxists seizing power and winning elections in Latin America. Reagan believed all of that had to be stopped. What he begins to advocate is for the U.S. to challenge communists at every turn.
But that challenge, that doesn't mean committing U.S. troops, right?
Right. We're going to fight in a more clandestine ways.
Mm.
Mm.
Hmm.
CIA operations like training the Mujahideen in Afghanistan or funding the Contras in Nicaragua with illegal arms sales.
It seems like we're going to some dark places to fight this fight under the Reagan doctrine. We'll come back to the Mujahideen, by the way. Reagan also calls for a significant buildup of America's nuclear arsenal and conventional weapons. Even a prototype satellite network designed to shoot down Soviet missiles is being funded. It was never really
Mm.
operational or successful. And for those fans of the franchise,
Yes.
they may know that it was actually derisively called Star Wars by a lot of Reagan's critics.
Well, a lot of gambles to be sure, but history will judge Reagan pretty kindly in the end because, in spite of that pressure, he also reaches out to Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and helps begin the negotiations that ultimately end the Cold War.
Right? But even after that Cold War comes to an end in the late 80s, early 90s, the ghost of Vietnam hangs over U.S. policymakers and military men, doesn't it?
For sure. In the first significant military action of the post Cold War era, a UN coalition force led by the United States invades Iraq in 1991 in what comes to be known as the First Gulf War.
Right, right. And those forces operated under a standard known as the PAL doctrine,
Hmm.
named for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time. Joint Chiefs of Staff, basically the head of all the armed
Yep,
services, and his name was Colin Powell. Side note, he later becomes Secretary of State about 10 years later under
under
George W.
W.
Bush, right? So, how does Vietnam play into his approach, Zags?
Well, the Powell Doctrine has two key principles. Don't enter the conflict unless you have a clear, obtainable goal, and once you enter, proceed with overwhelming force to end the conflict as soon as possible.
Yeah, I mean that has Vietnam all
Oh, it
over it,
sure
right?
does.
We had no clear exit strategy in Vietnam, and there were constant debates about how many men and how many resources we should commit. Powell wants to know where the exit sign is
He wants
before.
he wants the light at the end of the tunnel in clear sight.
Absolutely. And he's also planning on bringing a Patriot missile to a knife fight. That's that
Hmm.
overwhelming force you mentioned. But remember the song by The Who, Won't Get Fooled
Yeah,
Again? I mean, that could be the theme song for the PAL Doctrine. We are not going to be fooled by what we did in Vietnam and have it blow up on us, literally,
yeah,
again.
absolutely. And for the rest of the 1990s, that's the plan. Sometimes, though, that plan doesn't end in victory. Yugoslavia in the early 90s, Somalia in 94, these are both complicated and messy situations. The US backs away from both situations for fear of getting entangled. Look at the Black Hawk Down incident.
94 and Mogadishu, right? So, I mean, here, those two events, the kind of left this gun shy.
Hmm.
We don't see a quick way out or a quick victory, we're not going in. We're not getting involved. And then we have one more seismic event at the turn of the 21st century that really remakes foreign policy again, September 11th.
I mean, when America is attacked, a stunned nation becomes an angry nation. The George W. Bush administration begins to formulate the American response to the attacks by Osama bin Laden and his Al Qaeda terrorist organization. What evolves from those plans comes to be known as the Bush Doctrine. By the way, those Mujahideen members,
There you are.
trained and supplied by the American CIA to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan, end up radicalized against the West and become Al Qaeda.
Yeah, well,
For,
man,
for more on that, you could watch Charlie Wilson's War with Tom Hanks, that goes into a little bit more detail on this topic.
crazy. I mean,
It's talk about a turn of events within a 20, 30-year time period.
when you think of how we funded basically the people who become our greatest enemies
Yes.
and perpetrate the worst crime on American soil.
Oh, it's unbelievable.
And that Bush doctrine that develops, as you were just talking about, that really calls for preemptive war. When the U.S. perceives that a nation or a stateless actor like one of these terrorist organizations poses a threat, the United States is going to strike first. We're going to bomb first and ask questions later. And
Absolutely.
in the aftermath of the 9/11 tragedy, that policy was largely cheered by the public.
But that policy also led us to ignore some of those Vietnam lessons,
Oh, yeah,
unfortunately.
absolutely.
When the US invaded Afghanistan and then Iraq in the early 2000s for harboring terrorist cells, policymakers failed to consider that all important exit strategy.
So ironic too, right? Because I mean, Powell is in the middle of all of these decisions, and I mean, it's his doctrine that
Yes.
really 10 years early is the new standard. So it's shocking that they can forget it so quick. But I
Yes.
interrupted you. Go
No,
ahead,
no,
Zags.
not
Yeah,
at all. It's right on point. And after nearly 20 years, American forces have left both Iraq and Afghanistan, though a handful of military advisors remain in Iraq, but not without many of the same questions about what was gained by being there that we asked in Vietnam. If we're thinking about this, that image of exiting Afghanistan a few years back, the media really drew similarities between the United States exiting Afghanistan, that C 130 with those last few soldiers going onto it,
Kabul
the
Airport, right?
Kabul
Right.
airport, and then the Saigon evacuation in April of 75. Like it was uncanny. And
Not to inject myself into it, but
yeah,
again, when I saw that on the news, all I could think of was the helicopters on the top of the embassy in
yes,
Saigon, right? I mean,
exactly. And the people that were, trying to break through the airport in Kabul, and the same people that were trying to break into the United States embassy to get out.
God, for historians, it was a really creepy form of deja vu. I have to say that,
Absolutely.
right?
Oh,
And of course, the other part of that tragedy, Zags, is that neither country, Afghanistan or Iraq, is any more stable now than it was before the American invasion in the early 2000s. And one might argue that now they're even more dangerous breeding grounds for terrorist cells who wish to harm America and the West.
and these policies and problems of the 21st century are truly bipartisan. They cross
Right.
over party lines. Neither Republicans nor Democrats can really claim the high ground in terms of accomplishments.
That's so true, but it's probably also true that new administrations and policymakers are always more tied to the policies of their
Hmm.
predecessors in foreign affairs than they are in domestic affairs, don't you think?
Oh,
Whether
absolutely.
it's Jefferson and Madison trying to hold on to George Washington's proclamation of neutrality in the lead up to the War of 1812, or Nixon
Yeah.
trying to end the American involvement in Vietnam, which had really escalated, to an Eisenhower, where, by the way,
Nixon was his VP.
Nixon
Yeah.
was serving as vice president, right? So how does this Vietnam impact us right now, Zags? 2024, as we're recording this podcast, where are we? What's the impact?
Well, at the time of our recording, we have the ongoing Ukrainian Russian war and the Palestinian Hezbollah Israeli conflict. In both cases, the U.S. has shied away from putting troops on the ground, but has supported one side in those conflicts while trying to exert diplomatic pressure in both cases to limit or slow the conflicts in general.
Right, and we have Hezbollah. I guess we should say Hamas. Hamas is
Hamas,
really the
yes,
organization.
Hamas, yes,
Hezbollah has a role in this, but
yes,
Hamas is
Hamas
really
is
the
yes,
Gaza
yep,
Strip, right? Well, right, and the Biden administration has been pressuring Israel to limit their attacks in Gaza, and their response to the recent drone strikes by Iran. We've also embraced sanctions to try and force Putin to the negotiating
yep.
table. But boy, it's all about keeping us out of the direct conflict, isn't it? And trying to stop it from becoming a broader set of conflicts that maybe we can't keep troops out. Maybe that fear that we're gonna have to put boots on the ground again.
It's
That's the Vietnam legacy, and maybe now we have to call that the Iraq Afghanistan
Afghanistan,
legacy, right?
absolutely. I mean, it's the Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan hangover. It's ingrained in our policy decision making well into the 21st century. It's always on the minds of the American public. It's always on the minds of our politicians, and I don't know if it'll ever leave us. It
Right.
was that much of a seismic era in American history and American foreign policy.
Agreed.
Well,
Agreed.
I'm sorry, folks, but that's all for today. We want to wish all of our AP students good luck on the upcoming exam. Be sure to use this YouTube channel for its content spotlights, unit reviews, A Push on the Road segments, and other spectacular podcasts. We'll see you next time on the U.S. History Underground.